Hi, everyone. Welcome to our presentation today on credit union benchmarks, trends, engagement trends, and benchmarks. We're going to go through some good data today that we've collected over the past few years on how credit unions compare to other organizations that we work with when we do employee surveys. My name is Charles Rogel. I work here as a Chief Consulting Officer. I am joined by my partner, Dave Long. Dave, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Dave Long. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at DecisionWise, but I worked as a consultant here for a long time and worked with a lot of credit unions over the years. So, brief introduction. Been here for about 11 years.
Thanks, Dave. Yeah, and so we'll both share our experience with credit unions. We only scheduled this presentation for 30 minutes. We do have a lot of data to share, and so we'll kind of jump right in and start talking about what we're seeing occur in the workplace. Here's kind of more of a general slide. And we'll get into the real details and numbers that we're seeing specifically in credit unions. But we've been tracking this for the past 5 years. And what we're seeing this year in terms of topics or themes that are concerns from our customers are these 5 topics on the far right-hand side under 2025. So typically we're seeing, lower scores or more comments related to compensation. And that was a big topic last year, especially with inflation and people being sensitive to their compensation right now. Workload is also a big topic in some organizations and some pockets of the organization. So not everyone's feeling like workload is the biggest concern, but it does emerge within several areas. Culture and diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging have kind of merged together, and that is morphing as we're speaking right now in terms of how people are measuring that either directly on the survey or indirectly with some other terms. We can talk more about that. You can see kind of the continuum we have here at the bottom where DEI is kind of morphed into more being a subset of culture and how that's operating. Processes has come up. So how efficient we are in getting things done. And then communication. We're seeing kind of scores dip a bit on the communication front in terms of current trends in the workplace. Dave, anything else you wanted to add here in terms of what you're
just some
seeing?
color on the communication issue. It does come up a lot. Prior to the pandemic, actually, communication was the #1 issue of every organization. And then for some reason, with the pandemic and with everybody going kind of more remote and everything else, our communication scores got way better. And so now here we are 5 years later, or at least from the start of the pandemic, and the communication scores are coming right back down to where they are. And I think it aligns with people coming back to work. I think people have been really deliberate about communication during the pandemic and for the years following that. And that deliberate communication is kind of dropping.
For sure. Yeah. And I think there's a need for emphasis there because it does raise perceptions in several other areas and topics that we're going to get into as we kind of proceed with our slides here today. So that's kind of the macro level, what we're kind of seeing and hearing from our clients in general about topics that they're concerned about and what we're seeing on surveys in general. Now we want to shift and talk more about what we're seeing in terms of credit unions specifically. And so as we work with credit unions, there's kind of 3 topics that usually emerge. One is the people component. And so there's concerns about staffing, and staffing, is hard to kind of maintain, especially when you have branches that might only have 3 or 4 people that are servicing them or running them. And then people might complain that, hey, we're understaffed in certain areas or retaining people is difficult. Keeping people trained, because especially there's a tendency to be a little bit higher turnover in credit unions. So it's always a struggle to kind of get your people up to speed. But also there's always new products and services and regulations that are changing. And you have to constantly train people on some of these things to keep them up to speed. And then people want growth opportunities. And typically you can advance somewhat quickly in credit unions with experience and whatnot. But providing people growth opportunities is difficult sometimes because of how dispersed people are across different locations and that sort of thing. The other topic we kind of call here is agility, because there's so much change in credit unions when it comes to products and services that you're offering, regulation in the industry, and then the need to collaborate across the organization to really deliver a good services to the members is always kind of in flux. And so you're constantly managing this change and variability. Some of this is due to staffing, like you lose somebody, now who do I talk to? And so a lot of that impacts the collaboration topic. And then the third one is really technology. And so, systems evolve, platforms evolve, how you're training people on new systems. A lot of credit unions are, in the middle of implementing a new system for their people to use. We're trying to automate things more. Security is always a really big concern, but essentially for your people, it's about where do I find information? How do we kind of make our systems more efficient so I don't have to go through so many steps or workarounds to get something done? And so we're trying to reduce the frustration along some of those things as well. Dave, any other observations you're seeing?
Yeah, so speaking to the agility category there, collaboration is really one of those things that actually wrote an entire article about collaboration and silos within credit unions, because it's such a major thing within credit unions. But what we observe is that it's really highlighted by the fact that you have member-facing employees or team members who are have to know, like when they're facing a member, they feel like they have to know every answer to every question. That gets back to the training issue. It's hard to train so that you're ready for every question that comes in from a member. And then once you get the question and you don't know how to answer it, where do you go in the organization in order to get the answer? Is it just a real common issue that we see, and it shows up all the time in our surveys?
Yep. And so we're going to show you some data behind a lot of these topics here that we're measuring, and how maybe to address these, or at least respond to people's concerns. So first, I'm going to talk about measuring engagement. We're going to show you some benchmarks around what we're measuring for engagement here. And Dave, I wanted to kind of have you explain this slide in terms of how we get to the engagement piece here at the end.
Yeah, and oftentimes when we think about our people, we're thinking about the culture that we have in the organization. And the culture, really, what it is, the way we define it is a set of values, norms, guiding beliefs, understandings that are shared by members of an organization and taught to new members as the way to feel, think, and behave as employees in the organization. An easy way to say that is culture is the way we do things around here. And so when we do a survey, we're not really measuring culture. We're measuring actually more of the outcomes of the culture. So the employee experience is just an outgrowth of the culture. In other words, the way we view employee experience is this is the way the culture impacts employees. So however, the way we do things around here has an impact on the employees. We call that employee experience. And so, but that's what we experience. And then depending on how we receive that employee experience, whether that's a positive experience or that's a negative experience or somewhere in between, we're going to fall somewhere on a spectrum of engagement. So if we're having a really great experience, it's filling all of our kind of our emotional and physical and everything needs, then we're going to be high on the engagement spectrum. If we're having a hard time with the culture, if we're experiencing it in a negative way, we're going to be pretty low on that engagement spectrum. So it's really kind of the culture is what determines how the experience that employees have in the organization, and the experience that employees have in the organization is going to determine their level of engagement.
Perfect. Yeah, and then we define engagement using kind of this two-part definition. One where we're saying it's an emotional state, again, where you feel kind of passionate, energetic, committed, motivated basically about your work. But when you feel that way, then you fully invest your best selves. And so this is where we get more people, it drives performance essentially. We talk about the heart, spirits, minds, and hands, really kind of committing all your energy into the work that you're doing because you really love what you're doing overall. And so then we look at engagement though, and there's a separate component. As we've been measuring this stuff over the past 30 years, we find that there's kind of this base or foundational level of satisfaction elements. And so there's things that contribute, the things that contribute to satisfaction are pay, benefits, safety, workload, remote work in some cases. When these things are working for you, you don't necessarily think about them, but if they're not working for you, they can kind of detract from engagement. Generally, satisfaction elements drive retention. You'll tend to stay longer at an organization if these are working for you, but they're not very motivational. So that's where engagement comes in. It truly drives performance. And then there's different drivers of engagement. We call them these magic elements because as we run a driver analysis, we typically see these things come to the top as the most important drivers of engagement. So if you experience meaning or impact or growth, you'll tend to be more engaged in your work. And what we find with credit unions is that people experience a lot of meaning by delivering a good member experience. And so meaning tends to be one of those drivers a lot of times. So then here's how we measure engagement. First, what we're doing is we're talking about the data we're collecting from these annual anchor surveys. So it could be annual, it could be biannual, whatever. But normally every year, most organizations are conducting an annual survey to measure the overall perceptions of their employees. There's about 50 questions on that survey. So we're collecting a large amount of data. But in between, there's other assessments that you might be using to measure other topics or elements within the organization about the employee experience. And we do encourage that, like creating a really effective listening experience is very important. But from the data that we've been collecting from these anchor surveys, we measure a subset of questions of those 50 that we typically measure that we call engagement anchor statements or questions. And you'll notice these statements are very similar to each other. They're measuring kind of the overall experience people are having about the job itself, like do I enjoy it, love it, is it fulfilling, and so on. And you'll notice there are slightly different perceptions here. So you could really love your job, but some days you don't look forward to coming to work as much. And so we tend to see that one score a little bit lower. Generally in credit unions, the responses to these questions are pretty high. So these are the percent of agree and strongly agree responses from our credit union benchmark. And you can see over the past 4 years, we've been working with about 10 organizations, 21 survey administrations that we were able to capture here. And we can see that in general, credit union responses to these questions are 3 points higher than our global benchmark, 4 points higher, 2 points higher on the right-hand side there. So people generally having a better experience overall in a credit union compared to that overall global benchmark here.
And this really shows this kind of Charles has been describing. This really shows the overall experience that someone's having. And so what we might look at some of these statements, we might look at them as outcomes of everything else we're doing in the employee experience. And so to really understand why are these a little bit higher than the average global organization, we would want to look at the rest of the survey to really understand, okay, what are the things that are going on at the employee experience level that are driving engagement to be a little bit higher.
Exactly. And this approach allows us then to kind of create profiles of individuals, understanding, okay, who's more engaged, who's less engaged, and why. And then it allows us to do some driver analysis too, to see those specific areas that are more actionable statements from the survey. So then using this subset of questions, we can then, we measure engagement by taking the responses to these questions by an individual. So if you said strongly agree to most of these statements, we put you over here on the left-hand side in this fully engaged category, where we find 29% in our global benchmark answer mostly strongly agree or kind of average strongly agree on those statements overall. And we'd say they're fully engaged. Another 49% or nearly half of the population average about agree on those statements. And so they're not strongly agree. Maybe there's a neutral response in there too. But overall, we'd say 78% of the population is engaged in their work, either fully or key contributor level. The yellow group are those that are more neutral on those engagement statements. So those anchor questions. So 18% of people typically fall into this opportunity group. They're more on the fence. And we can do some analysis there to kind of say, okay, why are they feeling that way? And very few people are usually disengaged in their work. So only 4% of the responses that we typically see are people disagreeing with those engagement statements that we would call fully disengaged and checked out. What's interesting though is we can look at this by industry. And so when we look at all these different industry benchmarks that we have, and this is just kind of a subset of the total of about 30 or 40 different industries we can look at here. We have our best in class at the top. So that's kind of the top 10% of our global database that includes over 400 organizations and 700 survey administrations. Look at credit unions. It's only the third one down from the top in terms of these other industries. The global benchmarks here in the middle, and then banks kind of falls here at the end. And so that's really interesting in our database overall as we see the difference here.
We used to combine benchmarks between credit unions and banks and put them into a category called financial services. Yeah. We've just seen so much of a difference between working at a credit union and working at a bank that it makes sense for us to split out those benchmarks into two separate benchmarks because it really is a different experience. I know some of my clients do worry about and do experience turnover at their credit unions, with people moving on to either regional or even national banks to take new responsibilities or big promotions at some of those places. But really, the experience of working at a credit union is different than the experience working at a bank.
For sure. Yeah, and it was surprising how different it is when we look at the data points here. So again, credit unions, one of the factors that contributes to high engagement there is people's dedication to the member experience and members being owners, and you're kind of all in this together and providing real relevant services. So that generally gives people more meaning and purpose in the work that they're doing. So when we look at the drivers, so here's where we can do some analysis. So then we take those 4 anchor questions we talked about, and we do a multiple regression analysis to say, okay, what other questions on the survey are contributing to how people are responding to those engagement questions? So if you tend to score high and feel really engaged on the survey, well, some of the reasons or some of the drivers for that engagement are due to meaning and purpose. So here's the M in our magic model. Here's seeing positive results because of my work. That's be the impact, or the I in the magic model. Opportunities to learn and grow. Well, there's growth, the G in magic. And here's this feeling like I belong here, which ties into connection, or the C in the magic model. So we're covering kind of 4 of the 5 typical drivers within credit unions. And the one that kind of is the top driver is the meaning and purpose. Again, it's highly correlated with how people feel like I can deliver a good member experience.
I want you to notice too, we say, my work gives me the opportunity to learn and grow. That's different than saying this company provides me advancement opportunities.
Yes.
Those are 2 different things. We do ask that separately. The advancements where we talked about, Charles talked about at the very, very top, between the difference between engagement and satisfaction. Having advancement opportunities really falls into more of the satisfaction category. It will be a reason why people leave the organization.
For sure.
Growth will be a reason why learning and growth will be a reason why you're motivated and engaged in the organization. But if I lack eventually the advancement opportunity, I might leave. Even if I'm perfectly happy.
And these are kind of the more actionable statements that help you understand, okay, what do I need to do to create, more positive experiences around these things? Because we know that's going to contribute to engagement. So let's transition. Let's get into more of the data here. So we want to kind of go through some of the high scores, low scores, and the typical themes or topics that we think are important for credit unions here. So as we look at all the similar questions that credit unions ask on their survey from that credit union benchmark, we sort these high to low. We say, okay, which questions score the highest within credit unions? Notice these questions have several questions about the team interaction, these 3 questions in the middle. But how my work contributes to the overall success of the organization, that's also kind of a sense of impact. And actually, these 4 questions are about the team interaction. And these score higher than our benchmark. So this 94% is 3 points higher than we typically see in our global benchmark for the same statement. Here's a question about collaboration. Seems to work really well at the team level, but if I got to work across the organization, we're going to see some different perceptions there. So this is really good. And generally, we do see in most organizations, a lot of team questions appear on this list as well. We did another sort here, and we said, okay, which questions score highest compared to our global benchmark? So as credit unions, as a subset, how do they perform better? Well, it's interesting. We see different topics here. There's a couple questions about the supervisors, like supervisor feedback and trusting my supervisor. People in credit unions feel more comfortable in their organization's culture. That's 8 points higher than we typically measure in that global benchmark. Here's the mission and goals, which scored really high. Again, that ties into a sense of meaning. And then tools and resources to do my job is also here. Any surprises from you, Dave, on this list or comments?
I mean, it is surprising to see in one industry that you would have, feedback from a supervisor being that much better. I don't know that that's necessarily. I wouldn't have guessed that as an industry-specific thing. Not surprised at all to see people feel more comfortable in the culture in credit unions and in other places, just knowing what it can be like, especially when we look at how close-knit the teams are in those organizations. But yeah, the supervisor one is a little bit surprising.
And then we'll look at the low scores. So the lower scoring topics, this is where we're seeing less agreement. Again, this 57% indicates 57% of people said agree agree or strongly agree to this statement compared to other statements. But working effectively across departments and functions is how we're measuring that collaboration statement. Remember, at the team level, we're collaborating really well. Here, less agreement, and that's 3 points lower than our global benchmark. So it's more of a struggle. And to your point, Dave, more siloing here, less efficiency when trying to work across the organization.
It's the number one issue that I've come across when working with credit unions, and it's one of those that's really difficult. And it's not just, I mentioned the member-facing employees, and there's struggles there, but there's struggles at every level of the organization where it's tough to work across departments and functions. And some of that is the geographic spread that you'll have, different people working in different buildings or different locations, but some of it is just the nature of the work you're doing that prevents people from working across departments and functions.
Yeah. The next one's around being responsive to ideas. We call this one of those listening or employee voice type statements. Stress scores lower, but it's higher than what we typically see on our benchmarks. Top-down communication, communicating about what's going on. And then there's your statement there, advancement, Dave, you mentioned earlier, scores lower. Still above what we see in the global benchmark, but again, less agreement on that statement.
So a couple of just weird dichotomies here. We collaborate really well when we work within my team. When I work with other teams, it's the absolute worst.
Yes.
I feel like I'm learning and growing every single day, but I don't feel like there's opportunities for my own advancement in the organization. And so you have these things where it's like, oh man, we've got it going in some ways really, really well. But then when we take it to the next level, that's where we really struggle.
Yeah. And we just launched an informal poll there on the right-hand side to get your feedback on what you think about collaboration here. We've got a slide on collaboration too, so we'll kind of put that together. Another thing I'll say is generally these are some lower scoring topics for most organizations. So when we show this slide with most companies, these are some of the typical suspects that appear on the list. So let's kind of transition and talk about some of these. One more slide. Benchmark lows. So as we look at these topics and say what scores low compared to the global benchmark for credit unions, so there are some that are lower. This inclusive environment statement, lower than we typically measure. Member satisfaction being a top priority, 6 points lower than we typically measure. Here's working effectively across departments and functions, progress on work initiatives, and then being responsive to ideas. So there's only a couple. I'm looking for differences that are like 3 to 5 points more than the benchmark. And collaboration comes up.
The struggle to work between departments and functions also impacts most days. I feel like I'm making progress on important work projects and initiatives because sometimes we need to work across departments to make progress, and that becomes a struggle there. And the other place that really affects is member satisfaction is a top priority at this organization. It's a top priority for me, but when I go talk to other parts of the organization, it doesn't seem like it's as big of a priority to them as it is to me as I'm facing the member right in front of me.
Exactly. Yeah, and that's the struggle is, gosh, I'm stuck. I really wish I could help you right now, but I'm not hearing back from my colleague or something. Mm-hmm. So I want to go quickly through these next topics. So we've got kind of the key themes. We've talked about some of those high scores we saw with the supervisor interaction. What I thought was interesting on this slide is we pulled all the different statements that we can ask about the supervisor perceptions. They score above our benchmarks. We're seeing plus signs on the right-hand side here around all these different topics. So this is good. Generally, people, I think, are feeling like their manager is doing a pretty good job in the credit union environment. What else do I want to mention here? A couple we mentioned already is that feedback component stands out here, the second from the bottom, where it's 8 points higher than the global benchmark. And that tends to be driving, if there's more frequent conversations, then higher perceptions on other topics here. The team environment is also very high. So as we look at all these different statements about team interaction, we're seeing really positive perceptions about that. So again, combining the supervisor team results together, it means there's a good local experience that people are having about their job. And generally, that's where, most people spend their time. Notice the accountability topic does score a little bit lower, but it's above our benchmark. It's kind of the hard question out of the topics we're measuring about the team dynamics. And to your point, this second to last question, collaboration, 91% agreement on that statement. Organization confidence. So Dave, this is an important topic when we talk about engagement. Do you want to kind of touch on what we're trying to measure here and why this is so important?
Yeah, essentially, and I would say this is based around the second one that you have there. I am confident this organization has a successful future, but mission and goals and all the other things that we have up here are relevant to this as well. If I feel like my organization is sinking, if I feel like we're not successful, almost nothing else matters about my job. If I feel like this is a company that is circling the drain, I'm going to want to get out of that company. Doesn't matter how much meaning I get, doesn't matter how much connection I have with people there, etc. I'm going to want to leave. And at the same time, if I feel like if I'm really confident in the future of the company, then I can see myself, I can place myself in the future of that company. I can see growth opportunities. I can see advancement opportunities. I can see all those things. I can see my future with that company. So this confidence in the future is really, really critical.
Yeah, and a lot of that is driven by good communication. So if people are feeling like there's good, transparent, open communication with senior leaders, they tend to be more confident in the future. All right, so revisiting collaboration. Here's some different statements. Now, we added a statement to the list here. We've already looked at the first one and the last one. We have another one where we talk about do other departments willingly cooperate with our department? Still scores higher than the last question, but it's 6 points below our benchmark. And then we did our little informal poll here where we're seeing that, 25% of the participants today say collaboration's good. 75% said it could, and I don't see the entire definition there.
Could be better.
Yeah, it could be better.
Yeah.
That's pretty typical, kind of follows what we're seeing a bit here. This, again, siloing is what we hear. To your examples, Dave, people feeling stuck when they're trying to help a member, not getting responses from across other teams. So that's where we see that play out. And then the last topic we want to tee up is just workload and stress. Generally, it scores better than most, than our global benchmark, but we do find these topics scoring lower within certain departments in the organization. So generally, we say it's more of a localized action planning need rather than the entire organization. Sometimes it's staffing, sometimes it's just the cyclical nature or the season, essentially. But this is something to pay attention to because it does detract from engagement. Another topic we didn't mention as we kind of summarize a bit on these things is what we're seeing around processes. So we are asking that question more and more and measuring that within credit unions. And it does come up quite frequently in the comments where just the efficiency, the procedures, either they're not being followed or they're non-existent or they need to be updated or they're too cumbersome. Those are some things that we're seeing that frustrate employees. And it ties into collaboration as well and how we interact across teams and functions. But just to summarize here, again, credit unions score higher than we typically see, close to that best-in-class benchmark, above the global, and definitely above what we see in the bank's benchmark. Higher perceptions generally about your supervisors. And so what we would say there is continue to invest and develop your supervisors as they grow in an organization because they are key to creating a good work environment. Generally, your culture is doing well. People understand and are aligned with the mission and goals, and they have the tools and resources to do their job. Lower perceptions, we touched on these a bunch, but collaboration, listening, and being responsive to ideas. Stress in certain cases, communication and advancement opportunities. Kind of a quick summary. Dave, anything else you want to add to the list here?
Yeah, I just want to say I don't want to add anything to the list. I think we've hammered on some of the same ideas over and over. This is the first part of a 3-part webinar series about credit unions. And so the purpose of today's webinar was really to get you all the data that we have and get that out there so that you kind of can see, all right, what are other, and hopefully you're seeing some of the same trends in your own organizations that possibly we can help you with on the following webinars. Because after we talk about kind of here's what the numbers say, here's what the data tells us, we do plan on talking about, okay, how do we address these things, in the organizations that we work with How are they being addressed? What are the best practices and things like that? And so really what we wanted to do is kind of emphasize, mostly what we see is engagement is pretty high. And yet a lot of the credit unions we work with, they have a problem with retaining their employees. So you have these great things that help people to be retained in the organization, or excuse me, to be engaged in the organization. But then when it comes to retention, it's a little bit harder. And so I think that's what we want to talk about as we get into the webinar series and really dive into some of the best practices going forward. So we invite you all to join. We're going to be sending out this webinar as a recording so that you can see, if you want to see it again, I'm sure you will want to watch it, bring it home, watch it with your kids, whatever you want to do with this, you'll be able to do that. But also we invite any questions as we email you out the details of this. We invite any questions. We're happy to answer those things.
Perfect. Thanks, Dave. And thanks everyone for joining us today. Bye now.